Hello, and welcome to episode 413 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perrodin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many others. How are you this August 26th, Bill?
I'm grateful, Seth, because we just passed 7 million views as we're recording this on August 26th, 2024. And I'm looking at the demographics here. They don't suck, Seth. I'm telling you. Well, 13 to 17-year-olds, 0% viewers. 0% of our views. 18 to 24-year-olds, 1%. But the 25 to 34, we're getting some real numbers here. 5% to 35 to 44-year-olds, 8%. 45 to 54-year-olds, about 13%. And the rest, everybody else is over 55. There's no surprise there. 5% female. I'm not sure if that's better than I expected or worse than I expected, but it's not zero, Seth. And as far as the recommendations go, the only way the experts tell us the only thing we could do to get those Gen Zers to watch is convert our format from 2-hour format to TikTok format. Are you up for that, Seth?
I am not. I am most certainly not. I am not. And if you are watching,
you're not going to
clearly
do 30-second snippets, 30-second snippets of history. No,
I can't do that. I can't talk for 30 seconds on anything. You just ask my wife. She'll be more than happy to tell you. If you're watching, you can clearly see we have a third member of our crew with us. We're happy to welcome back the writer of over 20 works, New York Times bestseller, DoD Award winner, Thomas Jefferson Award winner, author of this fantastic book, Race of Aces, which is we're going to conclude our conversation on about today, and his newest book, 53 Days on Starvation Island. John Bruning, welcome back to the show. Good to have you, my friend. How are you doing?
I am very, very happy to be back. It's always a pleasure to talk to you guys because you get so deep into the details. Nobody else does what you do.
No, we do. We do indeed. And
for better or worse.
Yes, for better or worse. For better or worse.
I had to go back and study because some of the questions that you sent me ahead of time, I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't remember this. I wrote this book 7 years ago.
Oh my gosh. I say it all the time. People have no earthly clue how much effort is put into each and every one of these episodes. So when people say, you need to do an episode on this, I'm like, calm yourself. We're trying to get through what I got to get through first. Just give me some time. But Lord, it takes a while. But before we do get started, I want to make a personal announcement. I'm just very proud of my son. My boy just last week passed his Eagle Scout Board of Review. He is awesome. Officially an Eagle Scout, or technically an Eagle Scout. He hasn't gotten the court. We haven't done the Court of Honor yet, but it will be coming soon. But yes, I am extremely proud of my young man. He worked very, very hard. So
I should have wore my National Eagle Scout Association shirt today. I have one. I'm a life member. There's Seth.
Yeah. It's a pretty.
Congratulations to your son.
You.
That's awesome.
Yeah, certainly related to him. Yeah. He's pretty. He was pretty. He's very stoic. He's very, laser focused, very serious. And when he got out of that, we walked back to the truck, and he slapped me on the back, which is something he does not do. Like he slapped me on the back and got kind of did a little leap for joy and was like, yeah. And I'm like, for my son to do that, that's a big deal, So it clearly meant a lot to him. Well, way back in season 2, John, Bill, and I spoke about the great ace race in the Pacific Theater. In 1943, General George Kenney's 5th Air Force, for the most part, was flying out of New Guinea. In those bloody skies, Kenney's 5th Air Force began to carve out a legend of sorts. Competition amongst American fighter jocks, notably Richard Bong and his comrades, began to take center stage on American newspapers of the day. The exploits of men like Bong, Tommy McGuire, Charles McDonald, and Tom Lynch, as well as many others, captivated American civilians with the thrilling descriptions of their aerial adventures, leaving the hero-hungry populace hanging on every word and every kill. The papers made a storyline of pilot-to-pilot rivalry and the thrill of the hunt driving each man to stay ahead of the other. Was it reality or just media hokum? In theater, the rivalry was real, very real. Men like Richard Bong, McGuire, and Neel Kearby were all too aware of Ace of Aces, Eddie Rickenbacker's American ace total of 26 kills. The race to chase down Rickenbacker's record would prove to be a fatal one for both the Japanese and the Americans who chased the record. And while the stories of the race seem to be purely legend, as we will see, that legend was based in very real fact. John, I've said it before, but your book brought to light, Race of Aces, brought to light this story that even to guys like us who've studied this war for most of our adult lives, it's one of those little things that, if you weren't living in the moment of 1943, 44, 45, that race that it was kind of got lost on people, but it was a real thing, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And the longer it went on, the more skewed the behavior became. And that's one of the reasons why so many of the members or the participants of the race ended up getting killed, for sure.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
there was, go ahead, John.
Oh, I was just going to say, one of the major themes as I wrote the book was, there's a distinction, there's a line between devotion and duty and personal aggrandizement through military service. And that line got crossed more than once during the race, for sure, even by Kenny, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, we're gonna see this in detail here today because there was a guy that when we first did our episode about this ace race, we generally kind of focused on McGuire and Bong for obvious reasons. And there was a dude we left out of the ace race discussion purposely because we wanted to focus on those two guys. But we got to talk about this guy because he was a maverick. He literally, in all sense of the word, he was a fiery leader and an American hero all the same. And that man is Neel Kearby. Neel Kearby flew an airplane, and we're going to get into detail here in just a few minutes about it, that you don't really associate with the Pacific Theater very much. And of course, that's the P-47, the Jug, the P-47 Thunderbolt was, of course, the aircraft that we're talking about. We talked about him very, very briefly, but we didn't get into any detail. He was from Texas, born in 1911. And by that standard, in 1943, 44, he was an old man, wasn't he, at that time?
Oh, absolutely. He had been a pre-war fighter pilot, had spent his entire life wanting to be a fighter pilot. He was, like all of us grew up, all of us of Gen X grew up watching Baba Black Sheep and Black Sheep Squadron, right?
Yep.
And we all loved Pappy Boyington and the exploits of the Black Sheep. For Kearby, it was the World War I aces. He was obsessed with them. He actually kept files on each of the great aces and vowed to actually, beat Rickenbacker's score someday when he got into the Air Corps. And he was a fantastic fighter pilot. Pre-war, he was probably one of the top three in the entire Army Air Force. And there are tales of him mock dogfighting his own pilots in the 30s and either smoking a cigarette in the cockpit while he was, completely humiliating them, or eating an apple. There's one apocryphal tale of him just, chomping on an apple as he's in the middle of a dogfight with some neophyte pilot. He's just crushing him. So he was ambitious. He had a goal. He was singular of focus, and he was an absolutely outstanding professional fighter pilot, not a wartime creation, but a pre-war dedicated professional.
Yeah.
What a great movie scene that would be with him inverted, picking his apple up off the canopy over his head, right? So
because he was inverted.
Yeah, right. Because I was inverted. Well, when he gets to theater, he goes to see Kenny, and one of his parting lines as he's going out of there is, "Who are the top scorers here? I need to know who to beat." So he goes in to theater with the express goal of becoming America's top fighter ace. And obviously that's, ambitious and fighter pilots I've known quite many of them in my life. They are all like that. But like this dude made no bones about it. He's like, I'm coming here to kick ass, and I'm going to be the best there is out here. So who do I need to beat? And so this ace race to him specifically was a real deal. Bill, he comes in the theater and he's not just some fighter jock. He's the CEO of a unit. Can you tell us about this, about what's going on here in the planes that he's flying?
Yeah, he's not just a squadron CO, he's a group CO at this point. He's the 348th Fighter Group. It's because he was old. You know, as you said, Seth, I think the guy was way ancient, 33 years old. My goodness. How old is that? Now, for these guys,
Oh, these
it
guys,
was old, right? One of our complaints about World War II movies is they always make the actors are way older than the characters they're playing really were. There was some 40-year-old playing some 22-year-old, whereas a 33-year-old, he was actually approaching the age of what the actor who played him might have been.
right.
And he's flying these P-47 Thunderbolts, as you said, Seth. And the arrival of the 47 was not seen as welcome in the eyes of Kenny or anybody else, except for Kirby and his flyers. Kenny wanted the new P-51, as did pretty much everybody else, or maybe some 38s, as the one in theater racking up the kills in the hands of men like Dick Bong in 38s. However, Kirby, believed the big airplane, this Jug, was the real thing, and he thought he could do some stuff with it. So tell us about this 47. John, is it really as good as people as Kirby thought it would be?
Well, so the 348th was supposed to go to Europe and join the 8th Air Force. And it was only through machinating and going over Arnold that the 348th ended up in the Pacific. And they were the first Thunderbolt unit to the Pacific. And basically what happened was Kinney ended up, after the Battle of Bismarck Sea, coming back to Washington to discuss the new strafer tactics and whatnot. And he was the flavor of the hour because of the victory at Bismarck Sea. He was getting tons of ink. His prestige was high. And so he visited with the president, and FDR asked him, is there anything you need? He said, I could use a few more fighter groups and bomber groups. And he'd already asked Arnold, and Arnold had said, no, I can't spare anything. Well,
Right.
FDR went, okay, I'll make it happen. And the 348th was one of them that he got. So when the 348th first arrived, the guys were extremely cocky. They weren't respectful of the veterans who'd been up in New Guinea fighting for a year. And part of that was a reflection of Kirby and his leadership, because he was a very cocky, seat of the pants kind of guy in certain ways. Like his belief in his ability to fly anything was such that, I mean, there's a story I found where he jumped into a B-26 and flew it up to New Guinea. He'd never flown a B-26 before, and that is a tricky medium bomber to fly. So these are the sorts of attitudes they brought in, and then they had all sorts of problems with the P-47 in Australia, and the morale started to ebb within the 348th when they realized, well, maybe we don't have as great of an airplane as we thought we did. So to try to boost morale, Kirby went around and challenged some of the great aces from the 5th Air Force to individual duels over friendly airfields, just one-on-one mock combat, to prove the value of the P-47. So he tangled with Bong, and I know he had an epic fight with Gerald Johnson, the 9th Fighter Squadron CO, who later went on to take command of the 49th. And he did that around different bases to show that, yeah, the P-47 was a formidable and capable fighter. The problem with it was much better suited for high altitude operations in Europe than really the medium altitude operations in New Guinea and the Southwest Pacific. It was not very good below 20,000 feet. You couldn't exploit the best parts of its performance envelope. So, it didn't climb very well. It had a very short range at the time. It had a very slow rate of acceleration. It was heavy. It wasn't maneuverable. So there were a lot of downsides. But the way Kirby taught his men to fly, and as long as you rigidly adhered to his tactical framework, they had tremendous success, and Kirby included, of course. And that was use it as an energy fighter. Make sure that you have the altitude advantage. Then you dive down, you hit your target, you climb back up. You trade your speed for altitude to get back up above the fight, and you dictate the course of the fight to the enemy. And he was exceptional at doing that, as you'll see in the coming months as we talk about those.
I mean, the 47 was a legendary airplane in Europe. And, when you think of the 47, you think of really one unit. And of course, that's the 56 fighter group. But, and exactly to your point, Zemke's Wolfpack could fly at, 28,000, 30,000 feet and, beat people down all day long. But in the Pacific, that was not really the realm of combat, of aerial combat through any part of the war. Yeah, there were some high altitude duels for sure. Absolutely. But by and large, you're 100% right. Most of these altitude fights are taking in medium to lower altitudes, and that just wasn't the 47's jive. But the one thing the 47 could do was shoot things up. Good God, 850 caliber machine guns. I mean, that thing's like a flying tank. It was kind of the A-10 of its day, really. I mean, it was an absolute beast. It was heavy, like you said, 9,000 pounds, I think, at a dead weight. It was just an absolute friggin' tank. The range or lack thereof of these 47s, John, this really hindered their early usage, didn't it?
Oh, for sure. And it also contributed to a big dust up with Kenny in early 44. But basically, when the 348th first deployed to New Guinea, they discovered that it really just the aircraft didn't have the range to get to where the Japanese were. So they used the P-47s to escort air transport convoys around to the different forward bases like at Wewak and as they were starting to move up to the Markham Valley to some of the bases around there. So they were really doing secondary operations, and they were teamed up a lot of the times with P-39s because 39 was a pretty useless interceptor. So until those got replaced, they were used in that sort of role as well. This did not suit Kirby, and he was not somebody who was going to sit around and just do milk run missions with his aerial tank with the 850 caliber machine guns. He wanted to go shoot stuff. So in early August, he was on a mission, and Gerald Johnson's 9th Fighter Squadron saw the P-47s from the 348th and thought they were Japanese fighters because they had snub-nosed radial engines, right? He dove to attack them, and at the last second realized that they were American planes and pulled off the attack. And the two of them forged a friendship after that incident. I don't know who went to talk to who, but somehow the two of them became friends. And I'm pretty sure that was the entry point Kirby used to get on the Wewak raids and fly a P-38, which he had never done before. So he actually, while his guys were flying a milk run, he flew the Wewak raids in mid-August, where there was all sorts of fighting, and he downed a couple of airplanes.
Right.
We're talking about 44 now with these Wewak raids?
43.
August of 43, yeah.
43, okay.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
Go ahead, John.
One other point about the P-47. When the 5th Air Force's supply chain of brand new P-38s dried up as a result of what was going on in Europe, this was in the fall of 43, and they had suffered heavy losses over Rabaul. Kenny had to actually convert a number of P-38 squadrons to P-47s, including the 9th, the Flying Knights, which was Bong and Johnson's squadron. McGuire was in it for a while too. But also the other units in the 49th Fighter Group, the 7th and 8th Fighter Squadrons, traded their P-40s for brand new P-47Ds. They hated them. And as soon as they could, they reconverted back to P-40s. So
Wow.
imagine that happening in the ETO. I mean, it's just, that's inconceivable. But that's what happened in the 5th Air Force.
But it's a different kind of fight, though. It's a totally different fight, though, than what's going on over Bremen.
100%. And as far as the range issue went, the idea was posited to stuff an extra fuel tank behind the pilot in the fuselage. So not just, add some belly tanks or drop tanks, but also increase the actual internal fuel load. Well, the 348 Fighter Group pilots resisted that, and so did later the 58 Fighter Group pilots. And morale tanked because Kenny forced them to do this. And at one point, I found a letter between Kenny and Wordsmith, and I'd never seen Kenny say anything disparaging about his pilots. But he came very close to calling the P-47 pilots cowards for not being willing to fly with those extra tanks or extra tank behind them.
Yeah,
but
never heard of that before. Well, you brought up morale, and it's something that needs to be talked about. We've every time the three of us get together, we somehow end up on this topic. However, it's very, very important because Kirby could see. He's not stupid. He's a leader of men. He could see that the morale amongst his flyers was low, and he wanted to get them into combat. And you alluded to this just a minute ago. Is he brings his unit up to, I'll put in the notes, the tip of his own spear, because he decides to try and get his group into combat in any way, shape, or form. Can you talk about his leadership style, Buck Kirby's leadership style, and how he addressed this morale issue?
He was brash. He was outspoken. He was entirely devoted to his pilots, and they felt that. So he would go to bat for him. He would lay his creds on the line. He was one of the senior officers in the 5th Air Force at the time. In fact, he had more time in rank, I think, than the 5th Fighter Command commander at the time. So there was he had a lot of horsepower. So he protected his guys. He took care of them. He led from the front. When he wasn't leading the unit, he was off hunting. So they knew that he was one aggressive SOB, and he didn't take crap from anybody. This was a very ornery, aggressive Texan. Neel Kearby. It was singular minded, and yet he also administratively ran the group very effectively. I mean, he'd been in the pre-war Corps. He understood the ins and outs of how to get things done, where some of the wartime promoted officers who were promoted into the rank and given the jobs, like Gerald Johnson later, those were all things they had to learn on the fly in combat. So he was very, very good as the group commander. And once they were able to get the external tanks and fly to Wewak in the fall of 43, you could almost look at the milk runs as a workup period for them. And then they were able to figure out how to extend the range. They got the extra drop tanks. In 44, they ended up, I believe they ended up flying with that extra tank behind the cockpit. And they were able to get to where the Japanese were. They still couldn't get all the way to Rabaul. That was the province of the P-38s, but they could get to Cape Gloucester and other spots flying out of Dobodura. So that's when they started scoring kills and starting to prove the airframe and Kirby's tactics with it. So that's where things start turning around in the fall of 43.
Bill, John said the amount of flying that Kirby did by August of 43, or even later than that, he had an extraordinary amount of flight hours at that time, didn't he?
Oh.
I think the number is something like 92 hours of combat time at this point, which is more than twice what other pilots of his group had flown. Yet despite all that stick time, he seldom ran into enemy aircraft. He knew he needed to get his group to the Wewak area in order to gauge enemy fighters. And by the way, remember, y'all will remember Wewak from the Wahoo, and, you know, Mush Morton, one of those feathers in the headdress of that battle flag behind me is from Wewak. And I think that was that was also in 43. But the point is that despite all that sick time, he's got to get his group going. These were becoming milk runs. So for several missions, Kearby took his fighters, more often than not just a handful, not the whole group, to the Wewak area to go hunting. On October 11th, Kearby took his best pilots on a hunting mission to Sealy, and then the Wewak, hovering at 28,000 feet, kind of, you know, in that zone where the P-47 was a little comfortable, waiting to pounce. After loitering around for what seemed like forever, Kearby splashed one fighter and then waited for more. After flying for well over an hour over Wewak, a large formation of our enemy fighters appears on the horizon, and most guys would be saying, okay, it's going to get sporty. This is exactly what he was looking for.
Yeah.
Kearby and his now two 47s, that's all he's got at this point, didn't hesitate. Coming in on the flight of the Japanese aircraft, Kearby and his men were never seen by the enemy. Picking the rear end of the farthest Japanese formation, Kearby and his boys started to pick them apart. And pick them apart they did, didn't they, Seth?
Yeah, John, this is where he really starts to get his name out there. He shoots down, 3 Japanese aircraft in one pass. And he's, you know, all the great aces seem to do this. They pick the tail end Charlie, and they just go, they work their way up the formation, and they, you know, because the guys don't know what the hell's happening behind them more often than not. And that's exactly what happens here. Kearby and his men, they really run rampant through this formation in a pretty short amount of time, don't they?
They did, yeah. One of the things that's remarkable about this engagement, first off, the sheer gall, the sheer stones that it took to do this. Like most people would go, okay, we're outnumbered 3-1 here. This is ridiculous. Let's just head home. Now, Kearby saw this as a target-rich environment, and he had all the tactical advantages that make the P-47 such an effective platform. He had altitude. He could dive on them. He would have speed. He could basically dictate the fight to him, and there was nothing the Japanese could do. And that's exactly what he did. And the other thing that comes to light in this is, whereas later on you'll see how close like Tommy McGuire and some of the other aces would get to the Japanese before they opened fire, Kearby was an accurate marksman at long range. He would open up at 1,500 feet and hit things. So he was an incredible aerial marksman. It comes from 7 years of, you know, practicing on toe sleeves back in the States.
But firing from that range is how he's going to get 2 and 3 in one pass, because he can just boop, 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 pick them up down the line as he's going, blows through their formation. So they run low on fuel, no surprise, and they turn around and they head back to Moresby, but they have to land at Lye for fuel in the meantime. When they get back to Moresby, and this is what I find to be interesting and pretty cool at the same time, Kearby is doing this on his own. Like, he is, as you put it in the book, freelancing. He is doing this on his own. There were no orders cut for him to perform this mission, nothing. When he gets back to Moresby, he tries to hide it from General Kenny that he did this, and Kenny obviously finds out about it. And when he reports to Kenny, not only does he give his report to Kenny, but there's another gentleman in the room at the same time who happens to be General Douglas MacArthur. So Kearby is trying to hide the fact that he, for all intents and purposes, jacked a couple of P-47s, gets into a dogfight, waylays the Japanese without orders, and then he has to go to report to his commanding general. Oh, and by the way, Douglas MacArthur. That had to have been an awkward conversation, but it turns out pretty good for him, though, doesn't it?
It did, yeah.
But I'm putting it
MacArthur, that
mildly,
name
by
is
the way.
familiar. Yeah.
One of the things that I found when okay, so I have Kirby's Form 5s, which were his flight logs, right? He had to file those every month, just like every other pilot. He was fudging his Form 5s as to where he was flying. And you could document where he actually was based on the actual kills, both from the Japanese records and from other sources within the Fifth Air Force records. So I was able to find, he was doing this a lot, and he was saying he was one place, he was actually in another looking for trouble. And this was one of those moments where, he's kind of off the reservation doing this freelancing thing, and he runs right into the commanding general of the entire Southwest Pacific Theater, and, one of the great generals of American history, and his commanding officer in George Kenny. And I can't remember who said it, but one of the two said, "Hey, if this is confirmed, you're going to get the Medal of Honor." So the fact that he got 6 in that, or claimed 6 on that mission, really saved his bacon. And by the way, one of the things that came out of that was he really felt like he got 7, but the gun camera footage ran out before the actual ammo for the 50s ran out. So that wasn't caught on camera. So after that, he started flying with a second camera mounted on the combing, on the cockpit combing. So just to make extra sure that if that happened again, he would get credit for it.
I gotta say,
God, I'm going to get credit for this kill. So help me God.
Yeah. John, the fact that you as a historian discovered that there was a pilot who wasn't quite truthful, that's not great history. There's no surprise there. A historian who discovers a pilot who was truthful has made history. Go ahead.
Right. Well, Kirby used all means possible to become the ace of aces.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And later on, you see how he sidetracks Tom Lynch, which when I discovered that, I just started laughing. I was actually sitting, where was I? Oh yeah, I think I was at the National Personnel Records Center. And I looked at this, and I was looking at over Tom Lynch's flight logs. I'm like, oh my gosh, every single secondary source talks about Tom Lynch returning to the Pacific from his home leave in late January of 44. That wasn't the case at all. He got back at the end of November, but Kirby was the acting commander of the 5th Fighter Command at the time, and one of the senior officers in New Guinea, outranked only by General Whitehead. And Kirby sent him back to Australia so he could catch his score. So you see in his flight records, Tom had actually gone back to his original unit and was doing conversion training on P-47s that the group now was flying. And then right like December 5th or 6th, Kirby cut him orders to go back and do test flights in Australia or something. So that gave Kirby an extra month to beat his score. And he was very active in December doing that because he knew his time in theater was going to be very limited.
So those 6 kills are confirmed later. And on top of the 3 that he previously had, that gives him obviously 9. He becomes the first P-47 ace in the Pacific Theater. And he does indeed get the Medal of Honor. Bill, can you tell us what his citation reads?
For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty in action with the enemy, Colonel Kirby volunteered to lead a flight of 4 fighters to reconnoiter the strongly defended enemy base at Wewak. Having observed enemy installations and reinforcements at 4 airfields and secured important tactical information, he saw an enemy fighter below him, made a diving attack, and shot it down in flames. The small formation then sighted approximately 12 enemy bombers accompanied by 36 fighters. Although his mission had been completed, his fuel was running low, and the numerical odds were 12 to 1. He gave the signal to attack. Diving into the midst of the enemy airplanes, he shot down 3 in quick succession, observing one of his comrades with 2 enemy fighters in pursuit. He destroyed both enemy aircraft. The enemy broke off in large numbers to make multiple attacks on his airplane, but despite his peril, he made one more pass before seeking cloud protection. Coming into the clear, he called his flight together and led them to a friendly base. Colonel Kearby brought down 6 enemy aircraft in this action, undertaken with superb daring after his mission was completed. Wow.
The mission that he made for his own. So,
And 12 to 1 is a good point. I really always sucked at math. So 3 to 1 odds. It was 12 to 1. That's right, because there are only 3 of them. Those are ridiculous odds. You see that a couple times in Europe. In fact, I'm in the process of documenting a mission that 56 Fighter Group CO Colonel Schilling flew in October of 44, where he was attacking a formation of German fighters and was outnumbered like that. And I have the entire gun camera film from that mission, and it's in color. It's unbelievable.
Wow.
So anyway, those crazy odds, but they're counterbalanced by the fact that with the Jug, you could boom and zoom. You could dive and attack and then climb above the fight. And there was nothing the Japanese could do except evade and try to hit them on the way up or the way down. So it was, it was a calculated risk. Later on in his career, he takes more and more absurd levels of risk. But at this point, he's right in the wheelhouse of what the P-47 can do and the tactics that he developed.
So the whole freelancing thing, we touched on it very briefly, but how unprecedented was this? I mean, him jumping in a fighter and just going off to look for trouble, as you were saying it earlier, I mean, that, it's the natural aggressiveness of a fighter pilot, but you don't hear of this very often. How unprecedented was it, and was it contagious? Because we all, of course, know the answer that it was, but for the sake of our audience, lay it on us, man.
A select few did it. Let's put it that way. Kearby sort of paved the way for it because he had the horsepower to get away with it. And that's a really important point to make, because here he is in October of 43. He's now a national hero because of that mission, where he ultimately in January receives the Medal of Honor. And Kenny decides, this guy, he's now a major PR asset as well as a combat leader. I am going to need to protect him. So he promotes him out of the 348th Fighter Group, and he goes to 5th Air Force or 5th Fighter Command headquarters. So that's one command level up from group, right? So now he's in a position, and I can't remember if he was originally the assistant ops officer or the XO of 5th Fighter Command. It only lasted a few weeks in November. And then the CEO of the 5th Fighter Command went home on leave. And the minute that happened, Kearby basically stopped doing all the administrative stuff that he was supposed to be doing and used the opportunity, because he knew that he was acting 5th Fighter Command commander, and he could basically get away with whatever he wanted to do at that point. And what he wanted to do was fly. So he would go back down to the 348 Fighter Group, get a P-47, gather a couple of the guys that he knew. They were called the Musketeers in the press, and they would go fly missions. Now, here's where Kearby had the advantage. As the acting commander of 5th Fighter Command, he knew exactly where every squadron was going and when, and who had the highest probability of encountering enemy aircraft. So what he would do is he would time his freelance flights to hit an area of highest probability of contact right after another unit had been in there. So the Japanese would be low on fuel and ammunition, defending whatever base, Wewak or whatever, and they'd be milling around thinking the Americans were gone. And he would go in and just lay waste to them with the musketeers. It was absolutely brilliant. I mean, like if you want to, get into the weeds of this was really, really brilliant. Except he starts taking bigger and bigger risks, and then he knows, and his sense of urgency grows through December when he knows that he's not going to be acting commander much longer. And as soon as the actual 5th Fighter Command commander comes home or comes back from leave, he's going to be stuck behind a desk again. And Kenny is kind of tolerating this. At the same time, he's getting a little bit antsy and anxious that Kirby's continuing to fly combat. And it kind of comes to a head where he violates his own rules of engagement and gets down low, and he's shooting up some Japanese aircraft that were trying to land. And he and his guys get bounced from behind by a flight of Ki-61s. And I think it was Ki-61s. Anyway, Japanese Army Air Force fighters. And the only thing that saved him was the Japanese thought the aircraft that were pursuing him across the airfield were a second wave of American P-40s. And they opened fire on their own planes, which forced them to break off the pursuit. So Kirby actually got away with one there. And if you look at how he actually gets killed a few months later, he was essentially doing the same thing. So he didn't learn the lesson, but it was very, very close. It was very nearly killed in December on that mission.
Yeah, he was so fixated, more so probably than any other one, say maybe Tommy McGuire later, but he was so fixated on that 26 kill, as I put it in the notes, the brass ring, to get that brass ring, that he, as you said, violated his own rules of engagement. And Kenny knew this. And Kenny should have sent him home, but he didn't. And why didn't Kenny send him home?
He kept threatening to do it. It's hard to get into Kenny's mindset, but part of what was going on there was PR spotlight on his Air Force was useful. He'd been able to translate that earlier into more aircraft, thanks to FDR. So there was that context to his thinking. There was also the fact that, Colonel Kirby was one of the senior and most experienced officers in the 5th Air Force at that time. And this was a man who was incredibly useful. He was a great leader. He was a great officer. He just kept getting diverted from what he should have been doing because he had this personal mission, which was become the top ace. And they sort of had this whole series of conversations through January after he reverted to acting CO. Kenny wanted to send him home after he received the Medal of Honor, which I think was January 20th. Instead, he sends him on different missions to fix airfields and oversee projects. So he basically becomes sort of the fire brigade officer for the 5th Fighter Command. He went where they needed somebody with the horsepower that he had with his rank to fix stuff. And that's where he is in March, operating out of a forward airstrip that was just a complete and total mess. The engineer survey of the site had been done improperly, or they hadn't realized the amount of rain and the quality of the ground. But the strip was very, very problematic, and he was trying to sort that out. And he'd done some planning had a role in planning different operations and invasions and things like that. So, but he was no longer the XO Fifth Fighter Command, which in a sense gave him the opportunity to do more freelancing. So it almost feels like, when you look at it from that perspective, that Kenny was actually keeping him around to freelance. And those who think that Kenny had become obsessed with this whole goal of getting the top ace in theater, uh, this is evidence to support that. Even so, there's plenty of messages to Kirby from Kenny to knock it off, to stop flying missions, and he just ignored it, kept flying. So by the time you get to March, Kirby is at a point where he knows that he's within days, well, maybe a week or two of being sent home. So he's and Lynch is back. Lynch got back into combat after he relinquished his acting CO position of the Fifth Fighter Command. So now Lynch is freelancing with Dick Bong, and they're scoring kills. So now they're racing back and forth, and Kirby is behind Bong, but ahead of Lynch, I believe, at this point. And he goes out on this mission in March 5th, and it's a catastrophe.
Yeah. Well, that's Bill. Bill, tell us about some of the background to the March 5th mission, and we'll let John tell us what happens. But tell us how it sets up here, this fateful day.
Sure, Seth. Yeah, so in the days since Kirby had been, as he felt, as John just mentioned, exiled, Bong had regained the lead in the ace race. On March 5th, Bong downed another Japanese, and Kirby had enough of his admin role. The Texan grabbed two of his pilots and took off at 1600 and went looking for trouble. Over Wewak, they found it. Kirby picked out 3 bombers coming in for a landing and jumped on them, screaming down from 22,000 feet. This is over Dagua Aerodrome. And the Japanese entered the landing pattern. The protection of their own AAA was there. And as they approached the bombers, a flight of Japanese fighters appeared out of the clouds and closed in on the attacking P-47s, as 8 enemy fighters also took off and went after the P-47s. So the setup here is you got P-47s coming in from above, you got P-47s taking off from below, and you have AAA all in combination. So what happens then, John?
You know what? If Kirby had just made one pass and kept going,
probably would have been okay.
He would have been okay. That was his, his diktat. That was his framework to operate all the way until, the ambition started to bend his sense of risk taking out of perspective. And instead of booming and zooming, he made a series of low altitude maneuvers to come back and make additional passes. And he got hit. He wasn't killed, but I'm pretty sure, like, the supposition is he was wounded, and his engine was hit. And it was in it was a high deflection shot by the Japanese pilot, who was flying a Ki-43, so just 2 machine guns. So it was kind of a fluky shot, very, very hard to make. And Kirby went in, the aircraft went in just beyond the aerodrome, and he bailed out. And as he bailed out, he landed in the trees, and the Japanese Ki-43 pilots saw him go in, and they machine gunned him in his chute while he was dangling in the tree and killed him. And that wasn't really so. There's an interesting sidelight to this, because after the war, it was thought that Kirby's aircraft was found far to the southeast, like he had actually made it out of the Dagua area and was actually trying to make it home, and he'd been abandoned by the other guys in the flight, and a Japanese fighter happened to see his crippled jug and finished him off. And the data plates off of that P-47 are in an envelope in Kirby's personnel file in the National Personnel Records Center, which was a complete shock. I remember opening that envelope and seeing those data plates fall out, but they're not from his aircraft. So it created some confusion. And then when I was doing research in the Fighter Aces Association archives, there's a series of letters in the early 80s from a historian who was absolutely convinced that Kirby's musketeers abandoned him and knew that he was still limping home, which is why when they landed, they tried to refuel and take off or grab another P-47 and go after him, and had to be restrained. And he wanted to write this article about that. Well, it was all predicated on the wrong aircraft. The actual aircraft was subsequently found off Dagua, and in 1947, Kirby's remains were positively ID'd and located and brought home. And the forensic examination of how he was killed shows conclusively that he was killed in the tree, and the tree was shot up too. So, I mean, there were bullet holes all over the tree around where he had actually come down. And then there was a local indigenous citizen who found his remains hanging. Actually, the Japanese cut his body down. They took his boots and anything of value, and it was a local who buried it and knew where he was buried. So that's the right story. The whole business about the musketeers abandoning him, that was and that he'd actually tried to limp home, that was none of that was true.
Malarkey, as we like to say. All right, so the first time we recorded with you, John, we talked about Bong and McGuire, and obviously we mentioned Kirby, and we just finished covering him here. But a lot of the comments in that particular episode that I saw were, you got to talk about Charles Lindbergh, got to talk about Charles Lindbergh, blah, 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 Charles Lindbergh. There's a lot of myth about Charles Lindbergh and his participation in the Pacific, and I want to lay that to rest right now, because honor the man for what he did, crossing the Atlantic and everything else, but he was a different sort of cat for sure. And his participation, such as it was, in the Pacific Theater is not what a lot of people really think it was all about, was it?
No, not even remotely. And when his wartime journals of Charles A. Lindbergh were published in the 70s, it alienated many of the guys in the 475th Fighter Group. And he did that before he died. And if anybody has cause or really wants to see what kind of person Lindbergh was, go get that book. Read his own words from his time in New Guinea, and you will walk away thinking he is a despicable human being. Absolutely. I couldn't believe some of the things that he said in print 30 years after the war, that he had written during the war, about Americans who'd been fighting in combat for months and in some cases years, especially the ground troops. He was vicious in his moral criticism of the American GI in the Pacific.
Yeah, he's not what he's cracked up to be in the eyes of a lot of people. We'll put it at that, and we'll get into it a little bit in detail here. But I've seen a lot of people say he was a contractor and he went over there. First of all, there were no contractors like you're thinking of today.
No.
Combat contractors exist today. They did not during World War II, certainly not for the United States military. So that is false. He was not a contractor of any sort out there, with whoever going out there killing people. That is not how it worked. He was a friggin' tourist. Is what he was. And I think you put it, a killing tourist is what you called it in your book. But that's exactly what he was. He was a damn tourist. He had gone out there. He worked at Willow Run in Detroit at one point, and he did. And these are facts. He did actually help set up that Willow Run factory in Detroit that produced all those B-24s. He did do some test flights for P-47s and the F-4Us. He was a tech rep for United Aircraft Corporation. That was his job. That was his actual job. He does leave the United States and gets in theater, but there's a whole backstory of how he even got out there in the first place, or why he even got out there in the first place. Lay it on us, John, because I mean it's really some backhanded, back alley kind of stuff he does here.
Oh, it's despicable what he did. So his legitimate reason to go to the Central Pacific and the Solomons was the fact that he worked for the company that made the F4U Corsair. So he had reason to be out there. I mean, there were aeronautical engineers and tech reps all over the Pacific. Jack Fox was one of the ones who worked for North America and who helped Pappy Gunn develop the Strafer gunships. So that wasn't in itself unusual. But then his foray into the Pacific takes a left turn when he starts flying combat missions in the Corsair with the Marine Corps, which, you know, Jack Fox flew some missions in B-25, so maybe that's not super unusual. But then he talks his way into the Southwest Pacific area theater because he knows that's where the Japanese action is at. There are no Japanese planes left in the Solomons in the spring and early summer of 44. So he was looking to go hunting. And he manufactured a reason, said to the effect that I want to study two-engine combat operations for my aircraft company. Well, there was no plans. United Aircraft Company was not going to be building a twin-engine fighter anytime soon. So that was just pure fabrication. And then he leveraged his success and fame and some of the contacts he had within the military from that success and fame to talk his way forward from Australia to New Guinea. And then when he just showed up at the 475th Fighter Group base at Biak one day, I mean, the young pilots were starstruck. This was probably the most famous American in the world. Just kind of strolled in and was down to earth, wasn't arrogant, wasn't pretentious. He didn't portray any of that to the guys around him, but believe me, he was savaging them in his diaries. I mean, just savaging them, and the decisions they were making, the quality of the pilots he was encountering, the fact that there were naked women on the side of American aircraft in theater appalled him. He thought that was disgusting. Now, keep in mind, this is a guy who's married to Anne Morrow Lindbergh, and after the war, he ends up having relationships with his private secretary in Germany, her sister, and one other person. So he ends up in a quadruple love rectangle,
square, cube,
and has 7 children with those 3 German women.
Jesus.
So the fact that he's taken the moral high ground on, you know, images of naked women on the side of airplanes painted by guys who hadn't seen a woman in a year or more. I mean, the ground crews sometimes were out there for 3 years. It was kind of appalling when I read his words. So he joins up with the 475th Fighter Group, and he flies a couple of missions with them, and he shoots. Basically, the group hands him the opportunity to shoot down about as easy a kill as you could make. It was against a fixed geared Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. And that aircraft had no escort, and it was outnumbered. I don't even know how many planes, but at this point, but it was heavily outnumbered. The plane stood no chance. And the guys on the flight basically gave Lindbergh the opportunity to shoot it down. And he did. And he killed 2 Japanese military aviators as an American civilian. And when it became clear to MacArthur and Kenney that Lindbergh was out freelancing, flying combat missions with Colonel McDonald's fighter group, they recalled him. And they ordered him to come back to Australia, and they were going to throw him out of theater. And he concocted an excuse that allowed him to go back into New Guinea. And that's where so much of the myth and the mystique of Lindbergh comes into play, because what he told Kinney and MacArthur was, I can teach your pilots to extend their range significantly by leaning the mixture as they're flying to target and coming home.
Which is in the operating manual.
It is in the operating manual.
Right.
But neither Kenny nor MacArthur realized that. So they said, okay, go teach our guys to do that. Well, the reason why he had this in the back of his head was he'd had a discussion before he got recalled with McDonald about this, and said, you can fly these aircraft this way. It's not going to hurt them. Well, McDonald and all the other P-38 group leaders had said, we're not going to do that because we're afraid it's going to damage the engines over the long haul. And there was a huge shortage of Allison engines in theater. So they couldn't be burning through engines by, stretching the capacity of the aircraft to extend its range. And yet Lindbergh proved that it wasn't going to damage the engines. They flew a mission using the technique, came back, they pulled the heads off the Allisons, and there was no damage. So that sold McDonald and the other guys in the 75th. So when he comes back, he starts teaching that technique to other groups, and he flies some combat missions with them, and then goes back to the 475th. And that's where things really went off the rails.
Yeah. He winds up, his shenanigans, for lack of a better term, to put it politely and kindly, pretty much cost McDonald his career path, or his upward trend, shall we say, because he almost gets himself killed, doesn't he? Lindbergh?
Oh yeah. There was so it all goes south on a mission to Palau. So by this point in the war, late June, early July, there were 44. There were very few Japanese aircraft left in New Guinea, but it was clear that there were plenty of Japanese aircraft defending the Palau Islands, Peleliu among those islands, by the way, which is where the 1st Marine Division landed in September. If you've seen the movie The Pacific, or the series The Pacific, a bunch of that takes place on Peleliu. Well, there was some political restrictions on bombing or flying to Palau. First off, that was part of the Navy's boundary for operations. Second, MacArthur had told the Navy that they could not fly escorted bomber missions to Palau. And yet one day, McDonald and Lindbergh and 2 other pilots take off in bad weather, fly through bad weather north to go hunting over Palau in their P-38s, using the lean mixture technique to extend the range of the aircraft. And they're flying around high altitude, don't see anything. They're flying through the clouds. They start coming down lower and lower and lower, and they still don't see anything. So they're on their way home, and they get down on the deck and shoot up a little coastal convoy. And as they're in the middle of doing that, they still have their fuel tanks on, by the way, they run into Japanese aircraft, 2 float planes, and the fight is on. And eventually what happens, there's float planes, there's Zeros, there's dive bombers, all kind of wandering into this fight. And Lindbergh, now we're talking a guy in his mid-40s at this point, right? He was a fighter pilot in his younger years, 20 years before, in the 1920s. Okay, so part of this was him, I think, trying to prove that he could still be a fighter pilot. Well, he couldn't. He was not a very good stick jockey to begin with, but his situational awareness was absolutely dreadful. So the first thing that happens is he nearly gets shot down. The other guys in the flight are able to save him. Oh, actually, prior to that, he's making a run on a Japanese float plane, and he sees an aircraft coming out of the clouds behind him, and he turns and takes a snapshot at it and misses. It turns out it's his own wingman. So he actually misidentified a P-38 as a threat, which is hard to do
Right.
given the silhouette
Given
of the
the
P-38.
silhouette. Yeah.
So then he gets a zero on his tail later on in the fight. They are able to scrape the zero off his tail, and then he gets caught cold on the deck by another one. And I mean, like, Lindbergh just basically hunkers down behind the armor plating and waits to be saved. And it was a very, very near run thing. He was probably within seconds of being shot down. Now, imagine what would have happened if the Japanese had killed the Lone Eagle. I mean, this is the most famous American worldwide and had been since 1927. Maybe FDR was more famous by this time, but in terms of non-political civilian Americans, there's nobody more famous than Lindy. Everybody's asses would have been in a sling. Well, when they get back, the first thing that happens is McDonald gets pulled up to HQ to explain himself. He's in an area where he shouldn't have been, and Lindbergh very nearly got killed. And that torches a very promising career. Colonel Charles McDonald remains a colonel from 1944 until he retires in the 60s. He never gets promoted. And it's a shame because he was an incredible combat leader. And yet he made this one mistaken judgment. He listened to Lindy. He was kind of under the same spell that everybody else was about him. And they're like, okay, well, we'll go hunting so you can get another shot at the Japanese. And it was a terrible mistake. And the decision to go up there and hunt with just these 4 planes in bad weather, I mean, all manner of things could have gone wrong. So it was a disastrous turn of events for Charles McDonald in his career, and Lindbergh never thought anything of it. And to McDonald's credit, he never publicly expressed any bitterness towards Lindbergh, and they remained friends until Lindy's death, which is even more unusual given the fact that after his diaries came out, so many men in the 475th and the 5th Air Force basically reviled him. And that the real culmination of his moralizing came when he convinced McGuire and a couple other guys to go look at Japanese positions on Biak, and they were like climbing around the battlefield, just looking at dead Japanese, and I mean, it was almost like Lindbergh was looking for American war crimes. It was very, very strange behavior, and he did it repeatedly. So, the whole Lindbergh affair has been shrouded in mystery. It's been, the wartime coverage and the first generation of books that came out about the incidents really just sort of glorified the fact that here was Lindbergh wanting to fight and wanting to fly combat. But when you step back and think about what this guy was actually doing, what his motives were, and what he was saying about the actual warriors,
that's the key. Yeah.
I mean, it's just despicable. Despicable.
Hey, Seth, given the demographics that I revealed at the beginning of our show, the young population, it probably needs to be said, the reason Lindbergh was so famous is he's the first human being to fly solo across the Atlantic. There may be a lot of viewers who don't know that, and that made him a worldwide celebrity. And the reason he's in the Pacific is because he was a profound anti-Semite who would have played kissy face with his, because he adored Uncle Adolf, and so he didn't want to get in the conflict against the Germans, because to a large extent he thought what the Germans were doing was correct. And this needs to be said, right? And
absolutely,
he's buried in Hana on Maui, not in any place of significance, and I don't want to denigrate Hana. I love Hana on Maui. I love Maui. But the point is, because nobody would have him when he died. And when I was in Hana, when I was stationed in Pearl Harbor, I went to visit, drove the Hana Highway. And when I got there, somebody said, "Hey, you want to go up to Lindbergh's grave?" And I said, "No, because I don't want to be tempted to urinate on it, and I can't afford to get arrested." So, I mean, this is what I think of Charles Lindbergh. And so this was a despicable human being who happened to do one thing that was substantial and noteworthy, but for the rest of his life,
Everything in between.
Exactly.
Yeah, the turning point for him came when he was accepted an invite to be a guest of the Nazis during the Munich Olympics in 36.
Mhm.
And he kind of cozied up with Goring. And when he was the public face of the America First Party, or the America First movement prior to Pearl Harbor, I mean, he was saying just unbelievably anti-Semitic things. Like, I don't even want to get into that, but I'm like, I've listened to some of his speeches. They are horrible. And, just before he died in Hawaii, he actually wrote his three mistresses in Germany and begged them not to reveal the fact that he had a relationship with the three of them and had 7 kids with them. And the 3 women honored that. And when they died in the late 90s, it was only then that the kids came forth and said, "Yeah, Lindbergh is our dad." And the Lindbergh family in the United States went, "You're out of your mind." They apparently did a DNA test, proved that all of this was true, and they wrote a book about their experiences in Germany in German. I don't think it's ever been translated. So I'm like, he was looking after his legacy, just before he died. I mean, I guess everybody does that, but he
wasn't a good dude.
Bill, I am 100% with you, because if I had gone to his grave, I probably would have said some choice things too, for the things that he said about the fighting men in the Pacific, and for his anti-Semitic antics. And he got his what do you call it, reputation kind of rehabilitated and restored when the Jimmy Stewart movie about him came out in the 50s. And there was a little bit of a Lindbergh resurgence because of that. He was working in the aerospace industry still during that period. And I don't know, the whole thing, that episode, it comes up over and over and over again on the Facebook World War II aviation chats, and pages, and it's so frustrating. And Chris Fahey, I don't know if you guys know who Chris is. Chris is a former F-16 pilot who flies not all of them, but a bunch of the warbirds for Planes of Fame. He grew up around Planes of Fame at Chino. Chris is not just a fantastic guy, an excellent pilot, great American. He is also a flying historian. He is incredible. And he actually will take the time online to try to combat all of these myths. And one of the myths keeps coming up is, Lindbergh went out to the Pacific to teach these, ignorant American fighter pilots how to use their airplanes. Oh my God. Yeah. I don't know how he does that without day drinking, but
losing his mind. I feel, I don't know the man, but I feel your pain, brother. If you're watching this, I feel your pain. But I wanted to put this in this episode specifically because I get it all the time. We get emails about, you need to talk about Charles Lindbergh and what a hero he was, and he did this, and he didn't do anything of any value at all during World War II. None, nothing, zero. And I figured that if we put this front and center in this episode, maybe, just maybe, it'll shut some people up, but I don't think it will. But at the very least, we can say, we told you so, if you try and do your own research and try and figure your own things out. To close that section out, though, let's just suffice it to say that Charles Lindbergh's participation in World War II was both illegal, by the way, and surrounded in myth. And hopefully, with this little side light we did here, we put some of that myth to rest. And he was certainly not the hero that people think he was. However, there is a guy, Bill, that most certainly was a hero. And then he's going to be the final focus of this episode. And that man is Tommy McGuire, easily one of my favorite personalities out of World War II for a multitude of reasons, not the least of which is his leadership and his self-sacrifice all the freaking time. But Bill, set the stage for us, October 44. What's going on?
Yeah, a lot of those guys you call your close friends and great heroes, Seth, you had the opportunity to interview later in their lives. This is not one of them.
No.
In October 44, Bong and many of the high-scoring aces, including Bong's closest rival, Tommy McGuire, were sent with the 49th Fighter Group to fly out of the mud-filled hellhole of Tacloban on Leyte. We talked a lot about that. This was where MacArthur's headquarters was after the Leyte invasion. If New Guinea was bad in terms of weather, mud, horrible living conditions, and the Japanese, Tacloban, believe it or not, was worse, infinitely worse. One aspect of Tacloban were the incessant Japanese air attacks. We're talking about things like Guadalcanal. Remember our episode way back in season 1 where we talked about the daily raids and washing machine Charlie and all that stuff. It was happening here now. The Japanese made their presence known almost daily and nightly in attacks on the airfield with strafing or bombing runs. In addition, you had trench foot, dysentery, malaria, rain, all calling cards for the men at Tacloban. Food was terrible. The good stuff was the K rations, and that wasn't good. The men rarely slept due to the Japanese night raids and exhaustion from combat. Sleepless nights all began to pile up. Accidents due to fatigue, in many cases, mainly during landings on the muddy, rutted fields. This all became very commonplace. So when Tommy McGuire lands at Tacloban, he was well behind Bong in the ace race, and he knew it. Bong was the first to break Rickenbacker's record that we've been talking about this entire episode, and as such, was a national hero. Now, this did not sit well with Tommy McGuire, who was every inch as good a pilot, or even better. And McGuire deeply resented the fact that he had missed the brass ring, at least for the moment. So he had a new goal of catching Bong. McGuire was more determined than ever to become, as you called it with the title of your book, John, the ace of aces. And so there we have it.
So John, McGuire he was wounded, and we're going to kind of backtrack just a smidge here. This guy was every inch a leader and every inch a hero. The ass opposite of Charles Lindbergh. And he actually was wounded earlier than this, saving guys. Like he got down there to, I think it was an SPD or something, or might have been another P-38 that he goes down there to save.
P-38.
Yeah, all right, a 38. He goes down there to save and winds up getting himself almost killed. So, and in that time, he'd lost track in the ace race. But just give us a brief background of who Tommy McGuire was at this stage of the war.
The more I think about Tommy McGuire and the things that I learned about him doing the research for Race of Aces, the more I realized he was a man seeking affirmation. Mm-hmm. He came from a very strange, broken family. His entire background was a PR nightmare. They tried to sugarcoat it and write a new narrative for him when he became the national hero that he became in the fall of 44. But the fact of the matter was his mom and dad got divorced when he was young. He was taken away from his hometown in New Jersey. His mom moved in with her parents, and he lived in Sebring, Florida, where he was never accepted by the locals. He was a Yankee, and he was also a Yankee who was smarter than most of them, knew it, had no issues telling them that. And even though he was kind of a runt as a kid, he would take his licks and get back up. Um, I never encountered anybody who could tell me definitively whether or not he actually won any of those fights, but it gave him a resilient kind of fu attitude to the world, and he was on a one-on-one level. You talk to, if you had talked to any of the pilots who flew with him or who knew him, he was an odious human being on the ground, as far as they could tell. He talked incessantly. He was a braggart. He could hold 4 conversations simultaneously. It would drive people crazy. He'd be looking at 4 different people, talking to them. I mean, he just processed things faster than most individuals. In New Guinea, he also smelled. So when I interviewed the guys, they would tell me, yeah, he had a funk. I mean, everybody smelled in New Guinea, but apparently McGuire was an exceptional in terms of the funkathon there. So
That's how the Japanese would find him in his airplane.
That's how he lured him in.
So
Yeah.
so you have all of these personal characteristics that kind of drive people away, right? Yet in the air, he is a superb leader. He's absolutely self-sacrificial. That mission that you talk about, or you talked about, Seth, a little bit ago, happened in the fall of 43, and he saw this damaged P-38 being pursued by multiple Zeros. The guy was easy meat. He had an engine out, and McGuire was alone. And he waded in and knocked, he knew he was going to get hit. He deliberately exposed his own tail to get the nearest Zero and scrape it off of this P-38's tail. And he did it. And he ended up getting wounded and very nearly killed. He, his plane burst into flames. He bailed out. He was picked up in Oro Bay by a PT boat. And when he was in Australia, everybody assumed there was no way he was coming back from these wounds. And yet he comes back, I want to say in December of 43, and he's still so badly hurt from that episode that the 475th, is I think his squadron commander actually refused to let him fly for a couple of weeks. He ends up on KP duty. He runs the kitchen for his squadron. And he does it gladly because he's there. In fact, if you look at all these other guys, Kearby aside, because Kearby was supposed to go home and then got killed, but Johnson and Bong and Lynch all got time back at home. They rotated home. Johnson went to command and staff school. Bong did the brief tour home from the fall of 43 to early 44, and then he goes back home again for the summer of 44 after he beats Rickenbacker's record, right? So he's actually had 2 breaks. Johnson had 1. McGuire doesn't leave. In fact, he ends up getting promoted, takes command of his squadron, and you know what? There are very few squadron commanders in the Pacific who could have matched Tommy McGuire for his dedication and his leadership. I mean, the guys that I interviewed who flew with him said they would go anywhere with him in the air because he would protect them. He would take care of them. His entire focus was on them. And I think actually that's where his friendship with Gerald Johnson rubs off on him, because Johnson was that way when he was the 9th Fighter Squadron commander, and McGuire and he had been in the 54th in the Aleutian campaign, so they knew each other. And actually, through all of this, Johnson is about the only true friend McGuire has. It's very tragic. I mean, this guy is fighting a war where he's really an outcast. And, command and leadership is always a very lonely thing anyway, because you have to make very hard decisions that'll always piss somebody off. But then, the fact that he's got this personality that rubs people the wrong way makes it even worse. And yet here he is, probably the best pure engineering officer in the 5th Air Force, or at least 5th Fighter Command. He was relentlessly devoted to learning the P-38 inside and out. He listened to his NCOs. In fact, he spent more time with his enlisted guys than probably the officers. And he knew in his heart that he was a better pilot and a better fighter pilot than Bong. The thing with Bong was that he was a much better PR example. I mean, small town kid from Wisconsin, farm boy, had this sweetheart back home, had a very shucks, very mellow, humble personality, very quiet guy on the ground, didn't get into trouble. McGuire was attention deficit. He was hyperactive, and he was a braggart for much of his career in the Southwest Pacific. So, I mean, you could see that with the way he interacted with Lindbergh when Lindbergh was with the 475th. Like he would actually make Lindbergh do little stupid errands for him to kind of show him, hey, I'm in charge around here. Yeah, I'm the boss.
Yeah.
So when you get up to Leyte and they're at Tacloban, okay, so first off, why is Tommy McGuire, who's a squadron leader in the 475th Fighter Group, up at Tacloban with the 449th Fighter Group? There's some more freelancing going on, right? He gets up there ahead of his unit, and he's flying missions with Bong and Johnson. And I don't know if there is a more experienced, more deadly trio of American fighter pilots than those three guys. I mean, there's a mission in December where Johnson flames 3 planes in a pass, and they all fall within 100 yards of each other. And Bong and McGuire end up living together briefly after the media surge of on McGuire's relentless determination to catch him reaches its peak in December. The two of them couldn't stand each other, and Bong shortly moved out.
That's what I was going to ask you, is describe their relationship, but it was not good. It's contentious at best.
Total opposites. Yeah, and the rivalry was real, and at this point, Bong wanted it just as much as the other guys, and things go off the rails as a result. Again, Bong breaks formation and goes after aircraft on his own, which outrages McGuire. McGuire was, of the opinion, you fight as a team. You may be wanting to rack your own score up, obviously, but you do it as a team. You do not break formation. You do not go lone wolfing it. And when Bong does that, that really kind of becomes the inflection point of their relationship, and it just goes south after that. There's a moment where right after Bong receives the Medal of Honor and goes home, McGuire shows up in Gerald Johnson's tent, and just Vince. They spend an entire night in just a vent bitch session over, the preferential treatment Bong had received, the fact that the press had turned him into a Superman. McGuire, that rankled him. He wanted the brass ring. By that point in the war, Johnson realized there was probably no chance he could get the 40. He had 22 at that point, in December of 44. And McGuire just starts running his score up after Bong gets rotated home to go on the hero tour, the war bond tour, and he's going to be featured in newsreels again and all of that. And McGuire wanted to rain on his parade and beat a score while he was gone and couldn't, keep running it up. And Kenny saw that and pulls him into his office and says, "You're grounded. You're grounded. You gotta let Bong have an opportunity to have his moment back home. It's in the best interests of Bong and the Fifth Air Force, and it's in the best interests of the country. And McGuire is like not having it.
Right.
And so he starts flying missions on the slide, just like Neel Kearby did, and begins the quest. At this point, he's got 38. He's too shy, and he wants that more than anything. And he knows not only is he grounded, but they take his squadron away from him and they put him in group headquarters. So
Right.
now he's not a squadron leader. That actually hurt him more than anything else because his squadron meant everything to him. It was his entire world. Uh, and then they were going to send him home in mid-January. So he knew he only had a short time. And by this point in the war, we're talking early January now, late December of 44, early 45. There are very, very few opportunities to score kills in the Philippines. There's just not many Japanese aircraft left.
You said the special treatment that Bong received, and we don't need to get into every instance of it, but it was a very real thing. It was a very real thing. General Kinney saw Bong as the poster boy of the Fifth Air Force, and of course he was that. Much, he can owe that to General Kinney, frankly, but Bong does indeed get special treatment. People look the other way when he does different things, and I mean, he's allowed to do things that other people aren't. So that was a very, very real thing. And there was a quote you talked about when Bong broke formation and went and shot somebody down and then regained the formation. And then, when they get back on the ground, McGuire just explodes because it's like you were talking about cardinal rules of combat. That was his cardinal rule of combat. It's like you don't leave your people, you fight as a team. He had a quote that he said, um, I think he was talking to a reporter or something like that. And the reporter asked him, because he was closing in on Bong, and he said, "I'll get mine with my squadron or not at all." That's what Tommy McGuire said, which was clearly a shot at Dick Bong, and because he knew Bong
Oh
could
yeah,
get away with stuff like that.
yeah. Now you got to keep in mind that there was significant resentment towards Bong, um, and while there was, uh, Bong was just a guy who was trying to do initially anyway,
Mhm.
just to do his part for the war effort. He didn't really want to make a career out of the Air Force. When the war ended, he planned to go back home and become a farmer. Um, there's something very pure about Bong earlier in his career, um, that people don't seem to see or notice. Um, when he starts losing people in 43, when he loses those wingmen that he did that gave him the reputation for being hard on wingmen, it devastated him. And he was emotionally wrung out by the time he gets sent home in early November, after he lost Stanley Johnson over Rabaul. When he came back, Gerald Johnson, was there as the deputy commander of the 49th Fighter Group, and he welcomed Bong back. Their relationship was strained by the number of pilots he had lost, and Stanley Johnson was one of Gerald's favorite pilots in the unit back in 43. But that axe really got buried, um, or the hatchet got buried, uh, when Bong came back and they went up to Leyte together, and uh, it got strained again because once again, the publicity and the pressure to be the ace of aces really got to this young man from Wisconsin, and he began to do things that Kearby had done, that Lynch had done, that cross the line between devotion to duty and personal
Self-promotion.
ambition.
Yeah.
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 And it's you look at what happened with Rickenbacker uh after World War One. This is a guy who was just a auto mechanic. He was a sometime car racer. He built his entire life around the reputation that he earned in World War I. And he became a titan of the aviation industry, running Eastern Airlines, and receives the Medal of Honor, writes books. In terms of your post-war life, becoming the ace of aces could have been a meal ticket for the rest of your life. I mean, that's what Rickenbacker did. And I mean, that's still a dynamic in American society today. I mean, you look at what happened during the War on Terror and some of the books that became cultural, moments, like Lone Survivor, Marcus Luttrell's book. They make a career, they make a life for you after your experiences. So there's a lot riding on becoming number one. And yet it never panned out because everybody who is in the race ends up dead, except Charles McDonald.
Well, Bill, on that note, tell us about Tommy's final mission. He gets 7 kills in what, 2 days? McGuire does in 45. But Bill, tell us what goes on here.
So Tommy's killed at General Kenny's office when he is told he's being grounded after Bong's return to the States. And so that's kind of where we start out here. Tommy, like Kearney before him and Bong, began to freelance. Although he never scored in those few flights where he was freelancing, he broke his own rules and disobeyed Kenny's orders and flew on December 30th, 31st. He took New Year's Day off, but he flew January 2nd. Kenny cleared him for flights on January 6th, so now he's kind of quasi-legal on January 6th. Tommy had also been bumped up and out of his squadron command. I think, John, you talked about that. A fast track to group, but probably a blow to this natural leader. In a party with his old squadron, it became clear that his boys wanted Tommy to beat Bong. As stated before, the men of the 431st did not care for Dick Bong and desperately wanted one of their own to hold the crown of Ace of Aces. So the day after the party, January 7th, 1945, McGuire had lined up a flight of 4 38s with himself as the lead. Curiously, he didn't fly his normal airplane, Pudgy 4. So consider the fact there were 3 Pudgies before Pudgy 4. But he took another bird, saying his luck had run out on Pudgy 4. Oh, yeah? The flight was about to take off the books and, and had not been cleared by the 5th Fighter Command. Headed for Mindoro, the flight was airborne by dawn and on the hunt. Flying through bad weather and thick clouds, the foursome dropped low on the deck to stay out of the weather. In the process, the group became separated. This is a bad omen from the start. McGuire and his wingman, Captain Ed Weaver, was far ahead of the rest of his flight, rest of his section. As the trailing flight closed the distance on McGuire, Weaver called out an enemy fighter at 12 o'clock, headed straight for them. So they blow by each other. In seconds, McGuire hauls back on the yoke and turns his 38 in a tight turn, but he doesn't drop his external tanks. Remember, we talked about the need for these external tanks to increase the range. One of McGuire's planes, piloted by Douglas Throp, set himself up as bait, very brave thing to do, turns tail towards the inbound Japanese fighter. The enemy pilot followed Throp as intended and was shooed away from him by Jack Rittmeier's fire. The Japanese now whirled around and went for Weaver, Tommy's wingman. Still with his drop tanks on the wings, McGuire hauls back on the yoke again, snap rolls his 38, and plunges into the jungle. The great race, the great ace, is now dead. And this is an inauspicious end to a great American, Seth.
Ugh. Yeah, it's
Really.
It's terrible. It really is. It's terrible. I mean, you never want to see somebody like that going, meeting their fate, their ultimate fate, but certainly not in that way. Because, you talked about it a minute ago, John, and we talked about it the first time we talked about these guys, is that of all the pilots, McGuire, of all the great aces, McGuire probably, certainly amongst 38 drivers, was the best. Like just pure flyer. I mean, he could do things with that P-38 that literally nobody else on the planet could do. And to meet his end in this way, it's ironic, really. It really is, if you think about it. Because, I mean, he was a hell of a pilot.
That whole fight has been misunderstood and mischaracterized for 80 years. And unfolding it, and I'm like, in fact, at the time when McDonald received everybody's after action reports, it's like I can't make sense of this. It's like the three guys, or the two survivors, Weaver and Throp. They're telling the story of two different fights. They're irreconcilable. And for years and years and years, Weaver's main narrative formed the bulk of our understanding of that fight. But later in life, Throp went out and actually located the Japanese pilot who survived that engagement. And one of the first things that happened was that pilot, I think his name was Fukuda, he clarified how this engagement even began, because all of the early accounts of it said there was only one Japanese plane. There were actually two. So the first one was flown by, I think, a pilot named Akira Sugimoto. I think that's right. He was an experienced Ki-43 pilot. He was in a late Mark Hayabusa, and he was running along in the low altitude in the cloud cover over Negros Island. And when he was first spotted, he was only about 800 yards or feet. I can't remember which, but it was only 800. If it was, let's say, 800 yards, he was only 800 yards away. It takes quite a bit of time to actually punch the tanks off of a P-38. And the late model P-38s, when you punched the tanks, if you were not flying straight and level, would damage the dive flaps, or sometimes bang against the sides of the engine nacelles and cause damage. I went way down the engineering rabbit hole trying to understand this problem when I was writing Race of Aces. But there were a lot of reports from the P-38 units that these tanks were damaging the aircraft. So they would have had to reach down, switch the tanks to internal, punch the tanks out. I mean, to get a P-38 trimmed for battle took an orchestration in the cockpit that I don't think your casual reader of history really understands. And I didn't understand it until walking through this process with Chris Fahey, who flies the P-38 in the 475th Fighter Group's markings at Planes of Fame. And Chris walked me through how you do all of that in the cockpit. And I was like, God, you need 6 hands and 5 sets of eyes to do it. Jeez. And that was one of the criticisms of the P-38, was to go from cruise to combat capable. If you were surprised, you had to have your hands and your head down in the cockpit, and you would lose situational awareness. So they couldn't drop their tanks. There's a lot of speculation that they were just starting out the mission. They were over an island where they didn't expect any action, and that McGuire wanted everybody to hold on to the tanks so that they could actually carry out their mission. And maybe that was some of his thinking, but also the reality was the engagement came to them so quickly they had no time to do it. And the situation quickly devolved into trying to save various members of the flight because Sugimoto was such a good pilot. Now, he gets shot up in this flight and he crashes his Hayabusa. And as he's climbing out of the Hayabusa, on the ground on Negros, the Filipino guerrillas, whom I'm writing about in my next book, by the way, um, shoot him. And the Japanese find him with 6 bullet wounds. So he gets killed by the guerrillas, so he doesn't survive. But Fukuda is flying a Ki-84, which is a much more capable, modern, probably the best aircraft the Japanese Army Air Force could field during the war. And he shows up trying to rescue Sujimoto, and he is the one who shoots Rittmeyer down. And so in the course of this fight, Fukuda gets shot up and he crash lands at an airfield. The plane pitches over and the ground crews rush and pull him out. He's okay. But he kills Rittmeyer. So 2 majors on this flight, Major McGuire and Major Rittmeyer, both get shot down. And the junior pilots in the flight end up being the ones who have to go home holding the bag, explaining what craziness they were a part of. And Throp and Weaver, the mission destroyed their relationship. They told competing tales of what happened through the rest of their lives. And it wasn't really until Throp reached out to Fukuda to get his side of the story that much of this really starts to come into focus. And that is a key part of McGuire's story and his terrible demise. He was trying to save Weaver, and that a guy with McGuire's level of engineering knowledge, he knew that he was in trouble because he had 2,000 pounds of fuel under his wings. The other thing to keep in mind about McGuire at this point is, he'd been in combat almost nonstop with just a few breaks in Australia since April of 1943. He went to Australia. He was kicked out of the 9th Fighter Squadron. He goes to the 475th. He's there for June, July, and in August, he starts flying missions again in 43. And then he's in theater. Like nobody else that I have run into had that longevity in combat. And on top of that, he's still dealing with wounds. Just a few weeks before this mission happened, he was part of a strafing mission that tore up a Japanese infantry unit pretty thoroughly, but he took a rifle caliber round through both butt cheeks, came right through the side of the cockpit, and it was a superficial wound, but it bled profusely. He refused to even report it because he was afraid he would get sent home. So I'm not even sure he was awarded a Purple Heart for it. But he walked with a limp, and his butt was tender all the way to this last mission. So he's already uncomfortable in the cockpit because any length of time sitting on your Mae West is never comfortable. Those long flights in P-38s were just ergonomic nightmares. So he's dealing with fatigue. He's dealing with the after effects of this injury that's half healed. He's been knocked unconscious by explosions. He's been living on crap food. This guy needed to go home, and he makes a decision in the heat of the moment to try to save one of his squadron mates, and it cost him his life.
And I think that's the ultimate takeaway, is that the great ace dies doing what he was put here on this earth to do and what he wanted to do. Yes, he wanted to shoot down Japanese airplanes. That's not what I'm saying. He put his life on the line yet again to save one of his fellow squadron flyers, one of his fellow pilots, and it this time does cost him his life. And I think that's the takeaway that I'd like people to get from this, is that he was a hot stick. There is no question about it. But ultimately, yet again, he sacrificed his life to save another. And that's the key with McGuire. I think that the overriding theme of McGuire's entire military career through the war is that Yeah, he was ambitious. Like we've said this, all fighter pilots are. That's why they're fighter pilots, frankly. I mean, you don't put some schmuck in there flying a P-38. You have to have ambition to be a fighter pilot. You just do. Yeah, he was an ambitious guy. And yeah, he was a bit of a jerk. And he was an arrogant dude, but he also had the skins on the wall to back it up. But over everything else, he was a leader of men, and he would literally, quite literally, die to save his men or anybody wearing an American uniform for that matter. And I think that's the thing that endeared, even as a child, Tommy McGuire to me, is that the dude never stopped. He would do anything he could to help out his fellow warriors. And that's just, I'm sorry, that's above and beyond anything in my book.
Honestly, Seth, you nailed it. And I think a lot of guys that I interviewed in the 90s, um, I don't want to say they lost sight of that. The guys that were on the periphery that weren't in his squadron, uh, there was still a lot of annoyance over him. So, and over his personality and the things that he said and some of the things that he did, like the incident in the Ninth Fighter Squadron that ends up getting him ultimately thrown out of the squadron, where he literally bumps his flight leader in flight after he was told, "You need to tuck it in tighter." Um, this guy, he was all about making sure that the other guys in his unit would get home. And I mean, he proved it in 1943 and he proved it in his final act. I mean, he probably knew what he was doing was going to kill him. And yet at the same time, he did it because he knew it was the only chance to save Weaver's life. And, he couldn't bank on the fact that the Japanese pilot might actually miss. But he had to actually make this attempt. And you know what? I'm not sure every pilot would have made that decision. They would have said, you know what, I can't overstress this airframe. I've still got my tanks on. I can't do this turn. So you come up with some other way to, maybe extend, drop the tanks and come back in. But by that point, Weaver would have been dead. And Fukuda would have been on him. They would have been dealing with two Japanese aircraft down low instead of one simultaneously, because they entered the fight different times. Sugimoto left the fight as Fukuda entered it. So, yeah, as I wrote Race of Aces, I spent 8 years researching and writing about Gerald Johnson's life, and I've always felt very, very close to him. His widow was in my wedding party in 1993. I was close friends with his son and I saw his widow almost once a week all the way until about 2005. But as I wrote Race of Aces, the personality that I really, really kind of grew to respect the most was Tommy McGuire.
I think his Medal of Honor citation, which I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the last part of it summarizes the man overall. And it goes like this. It says, over Los Negros Island, he risked an extremely hazardous maneuver at low altitude in an attempt to save a fellow flyer from attack. Crashed and was reported missing in action. With gallant initiative, deep and unselfish concern for the safety of others, and heroic determination to destroy the enemy at all costs, Major McGuire set an inspiring example in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service. A lot of times when you read Medal of Honor citations, there's some kind of fluff in there. Not this one. Not this one.
No. Now, you look at what happens. McGuire's dead. Bong is dead. Kearby is dead. Lynch is dead. Lynch died in March of 44. Kenny has seen all of these ambitious young fighter leaders and officers die through the course of this race. And in the spring of 1945, he sends a letter to General Whitehead and says, you need to pull Gerald Johnson out of combat. There's two aviators I want for the post-war Air Force because they're marvelous, fantastic combat leaders. Gerald Johnson was one, and Dick Ellis of the 3rd Attack Group was the other. And Ellis becomes the vice commander of the Air Force in the 1970s. So Kenny had an eye for talent, obviously. And he was right about Gerald as well. And Gerald did not like being pulled out of combat. He finished with 24. The 2 in the Aleutian subsequently were never fully credited to him. So officially he has 22. But through the summer of 45, he goes from command of the 49th Fighter Group to the plans section of 5th Air Force headquarters. And instead of a fluff job, they give him a significant role in preparing for the invasion of Japan. So Bong dies the same day Hiroshima is bombed in August of 45. That leaves Jess Johnson and McDonald, and McDonald had gone home. So these were the only 2 survivors of the ace race. And in late August, after the surrender, Kenny orders Johnson to take in the first load of Americans to Japan, to Atsugi, to set up Atsugi Air Base to receive MacArthur, so he can arrive to, pave the way for the occupation. So he goes in with a very small contingent of 11th Airborne troops in a C-47, and he's right there at ground zero of the beginning of the Japanese occupation at the end of August of 1945, or the occupation of Japan. And he's supposed to go home. Kenny was grooming him to become a brigadier general, get a star. His son had been born in June. He was excited to get home to his wife, who he loved dearly, Barbara, and he wouldn't go home. He instead went all over Japan looking for prisoner of war camps and finding transportation for those guys. And finally, Kenny said, "You're going home." He cut orders. The orders were due to come in. And he had one final mission to do, which was to run some secret documents down to MacArthur's headquarters in the Philippines at Leyte. And he flies that mission down in a B-25. On his way back, they have engine trouble. They stop in Manila. As the engine's being fixed, a couple of guys come up and ask if they could hitch a ride as casuals. And he says, "Yeah, climb aboard." Like, great, we want to see the conquered land. And one of them is a guy named Colonel Underwood. They refuel at Apare and fly on to Japan, where they run into an unreported typhoon. Johnson gets lost in the darkness. They have intermittent coverage, radio coverage or communication with Atsugi. And with 20 minutes left of fuel, Johnson clips a tree on a mountaintop near the coast somewhere, south of Tokyo Bay. Takes 3 feet off the wing, still flying in this horrendous storm. He orders everybody to bail out, and that's when they realize they're 2 chutes short. The 2 guys they picked up in Manila did not bring their chutes along. So Johnson gives up his parachute, and so does the co-pilot, Lieutenant Nolan. And Colonel Underwood literally refused to take it at first. Kenny later told the story that Johnson actually pulled his 45 and ordered him to put the chute on. I tend to dispute that. Kenny was a little bit of Kenny, he exaggerated.
Just a bit.
But he flew the B-25 over a sandbar. The 4 passengers who bailed out all survived and were picked up by local Japanese authorities and delivered to the 5th Air Force. But Johnson and Nolan were never seen again. And Johnson's twin brother, Harold, was on Kyushu with the 348th Fighter Group, actually. And in the middle of this storm, when he heard his brother had vanished in it, he climbed into a little liaison aircraft, like a Piper Cub, and went in search of him. As soon as Kenny heard that, he grounded him and ordered him home so that the family didn't lose Gerald's twin brother. And Harold never got over that. One day in 1971 or 2, maybe it was 73, he got up, kissed his wife, walked into the garage and shot himself with his service 45. 2 weeks later, Gerald's dad died of a heart attack, with Barbara, his widow, Gerald's widow, there present when it happened. So it was a very tragic end for a family that was, very full of life, vibrant. You don't hear that side of the ace race often, but the last of the great aces was then Charles McDonald, who never sought the limelight, only wrote one article about his experiences, rarely did interviews, didn't want to go to events, just lived a very quiet life. And then when he passed, he was cremated, and Perry Dahl, one of his beloved friends from the 475th Fighter Group, helped spread his ashes in the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, when his wife died, McDonald bought a sailboat and just vanished for 7 years and just sailed around South and Central America and the Caribbean. He really was the one guy who did not get caught up in the ambition of becoming the ace of aces. He finished with 27 victories.
Jesus, a tragic end to a heroic story all the way around. All the way around.
Yeah, there's a dirty little secret here, Seth, that's probably worth mentioning at this point. You know, combat leaders will say that we want their warriors to fight for the right reasons and not pursue ambition, do things outlandish in order to achieve victory. That's a lie. The combat leaders want to win. And if it takes, an order to get somebody to fight, they'll give an order. If it takes somebody's personal ambition to cause them to do something that nobody else would do, they'll accept that. It's, I'm not saying that the outcome is, will be supported by the objectives. It's not the situation like that, but whatever it takes to motivate somebody to get you where you need to go, when lives are on the line, they'll use it. So in the race for aces, if personal ambition drove them to kill the enemy to a far greater extent than they would have otherwise, their generals will accept that. And I'm sure that their motives were honorable and legitimate when they wanted them to go home and drown them and things like that. But victory is really the only acceptable outcome. And these guys contributed greatly to that victory.
Oh, 100%. And if you think about it, this is an unusual problem to have. Mm-hmm. Guys who were eager to fight, who wanted to fight. And that was,
that's right.
Morale was in the tank in 42 when all of this started. We were taking a beating, and the morale was just terrible. But you really look at it through the lens of a larger perspective of military history, and there's time after time after time where an enemy just packs it in, or countries, fighting men pack it in and just stay, enough's enough. I mean, you look at Russia, 1917, 1918, and you had fine Italian pilots and fine Italian aircraft and ships, and yet the will to fight oftentimes wasn't there in the World War II Italian Navy and Air Force. So I mean, really, this is a testament to the spirit, the American fighting spirit of World War II also. But at the same time, there is that line between devotion and ambition, for sure. And where it actually is, we could debate that forever. Yeah. I kind of put it where if it's hurting the unit and hurting the team,
yes,
you've gone too far.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yep. kind of like Bong's lone wolf actions here and there. And I'm not denigrating Dick Bong at all. I mean, he was a bad dude. There is no question. But it's, some of those efforts that he did put the other guys out in the lurch. And that is, and to your point, that's when it becomes a little too much. Well, guys, it's always good talking about these incredible Americans, but we do have to wrap it up. Is there anything else anybody wants to add to this, hopefully educational yet stirring conversation at the same time?
It's just
I'm
a
good.
pleasure to see you guys and chat with you and talk about these pilots. I spent 30 years of my life researching and talking to the survivors of the 5th Air Force, and being able to talk about this means a lot to me. So thank you very much to both of you.
Oh, we're glad to
Thank
have
you
you
for
anytime,
writing.
man.
Yeah. Thanks for writing a great book. Several great books.
Yeah. Well, with that, we want to thank you very much for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast, wherever you receive your podcast. Give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. If you want to see the video version of this, now that you're looking at it, look at our YouTube channel. If you got a question or a comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, my name is Seth Paradon. I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching. John, thank you again for being here with us to wrap up this conversation about these unbelievably fantastic Americans. Thanks, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bill, bring us home.
And I'm Bill Tody. See you again next week.